The release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report made headlines back in June. 3 months later, in the middle of an election campaign, are the report's 94 so-called calls to action having an impact on the hustings? Let's ask Marie Wilson, Commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's good to have you here in our studio.
It's great to be here, Steve.
Let's just a little background first. How did you get mixed up in this whole thing to begin with?
Called to it, I would say, rather than getting mixed up in it. It was really something that I chose to do. I applied for the job on the most basic of levels, but what I thought I could bring to it is my own experiences as a longtime journalist and as a teacher, but also as one who had become, over the years, living in the North and doing a lot of reporting in Indigenous communities, increasingly aware of the deep impacts of the residential school experience, and realizing that I and most Canadians had in fact very limited or no awareness or background to it. I was also raised in one of the churches implicated in the big court case that created the residential schools and that led to the settlement agreement in the TRC. So I thought I brought a lot of perspectives and just sort of touched off by the fact that my own husband and extended family were all residential school students. And so there were perspectives there as a non-Indigenous person, as a woman, that I thought would be a valuable contribution and perhaps play a role in helping Canada realize that this is not Indigenous history and this is not an Indigenous issue, but rather one that was created as a result of Canadian laws and policies, and one that we've all inherited and we all now are called to work together on improving.
Yellowknife is home for you.
It is home, has been for almost 40 years now, but I'm originally from southwestern Ontario.
And how do you get from Yellowknife to here?
So go to Edmonton and turn left, you know. Okay. You fly generally through Edmonton or Calgary and then eastward.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, we're trying to consider what kind of an impact your report is having during the federal election campaign ongoing now. The three main parties have all responded. The Liberals have said they will enact all 94 recommendations. The NDP have said they will begin to implement all the recommendations. The Conservatives have said they will review all of the recommendations. What's your reaction to each of their offerings?
Well, I think the Liberal and the NDP responses are essentially the same. When you say you're going to enact them all, they're not all things that can be done tomorrow. They're things that almost, in fact, if there's a common thread through all the calls to action, it is about the process that needs to be used to do some of these things, beginning with ensuring that you have the right people in the room to figure the pathway forward. In terms of the Conservative response, you know, there is a more fulsome report coming out in December, but I was a little bit surprised, and I must say we were all disappointed, because it's not as if the government is not aware. We've had, part of the nature of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is we have had representatives from all the parties to the settlement agreement, which includes Canada and the Government of Canada, at our tables and at our planning processes throughout. And so there have been people there who knew what was coming and who knew what we've been talking about. And especially when you think that we did an interim report in 2012 where we basically said, heads up, this is where we're heading. So none of it should be a surprise. And I think the urgency of some of these things would have left us all to hope that there could have been a more substantive and intentional response.
So disappointed in the Conservative response, not as much of a commitment as you would like to have seen.
Yes, I'm absolutely not, because of the urgency of the many things that we raised.
There was a phrase used in the report several times, 10 times, that caught a lot of attention when you released it: cultural genocide.
Right.
In hindsight, you've had a chance to think about this some more now, because that garnered so much attention. Did it take too much attention away from some of the other things in the report that you might have wanted to focus on as well?
I think it drew a lot of journalistic attention, I should say. We have not had reams of other people talking to us about that point. And you know what I've often said is that it doesn't matter what we call it. It doesn't change the reality of the facts before us and the facts that have been presented to us. So it is a red herring if we are going to get involved in a debate of is it or isn't it. I should tell you, though, that we did not use that term easily or lightly. We had a lot of internal discussion about it, and we held back in explaining our thinking around that until the report itself, because we didn't want to seem either glib or inflammatory in using that kind of language. But, you know, we have the benefit of international declarations and laws and covenants that describe these things for us. And so we didn't have to invent it. We went to the checklist of what it says in the UN conventions, and you know, it was a checklist. Yes, this happened, this happened, this happened, and that's how we settled on the term cultural genocide. The other thing that was absolutely not debatable for us is that many survivors used that term, not cultural genocide. They used the term genocide, and it came up over and over and over again. So there was no way we could not we could not address the issue.
Out of respect for them, you couldn't low-bridge this
Well,
thing.
not only out of respect for them, but out of, as evidence that we had actually listened to them and heard what they had to say. And I think if you sit in rooms and hear people, but pay no service whatsoever to what they're actually telling you, then that is a disservice, and we didn't want to do that. But your original point is it a distraction? I think not. I think people have moved on in the conversation, and I think that it really underscores that this is not a small deal. This is a very big deal. This goes to the heart of what we describe as our values, both in this country and in the world, and so we need to do work on it.
Let's move on to one of those calls for action that you wanted to discuss. We call upon the federal government to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations children being educated on reserves and those First Nations children being educated off reserves. Give us a sense of how much it would cost to equalize that funding.
I don't know how much that would cost altogether, but I know that there are principles there. I know that the 2% cap is one that can be calculated. I know the Assembly of First Nations has certainly done the calculations around that. But I think in the end, the point is one of principle. Do we treat some children in our country better than we treat others?
We do.
And yes, but is that acceptable to us? That's the question. That's the question before all Canadians. And so we need to, we can't, and you know, one of the problems that happens often is the provision of education, especially in the farther, more remote areas, is more expensive. I live in Yellowknife, and that is the south by northern standards. And it costs more. It does cost more. Many of these places don't have road access. There's very often a churn in teaching and so on. But we also want to claim the whole country. We want to be able to assert sovereignty over an entire country. You can't do that and not provide an equitable level of services and government provisions to people who live in all of the parts of the country. So I think it's a basic principle. What's fair for some is fair for all.
After the report was released back in June, we had Archbishop Fred Hiltz here in that chair talking about your fellow Commissioner Murray Sinclair. Here's what he had to say, and we'll come back and chat. Roll the clip, please.
Education got us into this mess as a country, and education will get us out of this mess. And I think that one of the encouraging signs I see is that there are a number of provincial jurisdictions across the country and territorial ones that have actually taken significant steps to include in the curricula in public schools the story of the residential schools.
You saw the news from Manitoba just the other day, yes. Right? They're now going to have that as part of their curriculum.
And there are several jurisdictions that are doing that.
And beyond schools and universities, what other institutions in the country do you think need to engage on that to achieve what you're looking for?
Well, we talk about that in our report, and it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, by the way, but one of the areas where we feel there's a need for better information is in, for example, the law profession, those who are working in the judicial system, those who are going through law schools, and those who are already practicing. And just last week, I had a very, very important exchange with the Law Society of Upper Canada and was very impressed with the proactive work they are doing to see what they as a society can do.
That's the governing body for lawyers in Ontario.
For lawyers in Ontario, but it is also, by its very title, as you can tell, the Law Society of Upper Canada. It's older than Canada itself. And it is the biggest, and I think it would be fair comment to say, most influential of the law societies in Canada because of its longevity. And as I pointed out to them, probably some of their very own members, in fact, were involved in drafting the laws and policies that led to the creation of residential schools. So there's corrective work there too that falls well to that body. Similarly, the medical profession. You know, we see, and we have heard incidents over the last few years of Indigenous people presenting in emergency wards, being ill-treated or ignored, and dying in front of our eyes in medical facilities. There's a need for sensitivity. We more recently here in Ontario, a great controversy, which I know you're well aware of the contrast and sometimes collision between different approaches to health services and medical care. So there's work to be done there for us to understand each other better and to be able to go forward in a more harmonious way. And in a way, I think every sector, the business community as well, you know, how many Indigenous people sit on boards of major corporations? How many are CEOs and are senior managers? And how many are being groomed to be these things? And so we have to find ways to stop living in such splendid isolation of each other to the point where we can live together for 150 years and still not know each other. That, you know, that belongs to all of us as a society, and we have to start changing the way we do things if we want there to be any change in the outcomes.
I'll follow up on the healthcare part of that answer you just gave because, again, one of your calls to action, the philosophy of Western science and medicine does not accept the very principles on which traditional medicine is founded, marking a profound barrier to effective collaboration. Because they are lacking in scientific credibility, it is potentially unethical to promote Aboriginal therapies. So says the health status of Aboriginal peoples in Canada, Sam Gray, that's back in January of 2003. How can you expect conventional medicine to respond in the way you want it to, given the unproven, by Western scientific standards, nature of some Aboriginal practices?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to hear ourselves when we say Aboriginal practices. And do we hear in our head some notion of voodooism and something that is not real or legitimate? I think what we're trying to say there is that the worldview of Indigenous people, and we've heard this over and over and over again when people have told us what were the keys to their own healing. And very few have said, the key to my own healing was Dr. So-and-so, so-and-so. Most people have said the key to my own healing and the progress in my own healing was returning to my own culture, feeling part of something, feeling connected to something, being supported and encouraged by my own people,
so let's acknowledge that.
And that is part of the broader notion of what is health. What is spiritual health? A sense of who am I and am I worthy, or am I, as I was told as I was growing up, no good, will amount to nothing, worth nothing, dirty, savage, all those things that were assaults on a sense of well-being, on a sense of emotional health, on a sense of spiritual health, and in many cases on a sense of physical health, because so many people self-medicated and have been and continue to, and that's how they described it. You know, one person said very dramatically to me, "Thank God for alcohol. If it wasn't for that, I would have been dead a long time ago." Meaning that that's the route that they took to try to mask the pain that they were feeling for all these unresolved things. You know, remember, Steve, we're talking about children. These were children, and who have grown up an entire lifetime, most of them with no supports, no grief intervention, no trauma treatment, none of the things that we talk about now in the broad category of post-traumatic stress. And yet these were children who had no reference and no adults that were watching out for them and caring for them in a loving way. So there's enormous damage there that is residual damage that we have to face up to. And to come back to your point about health, because I think this is a really important real-life example that we have before us. And it's one that Canada, I actually told this to the Prime Minister when we had a brief meeting with him the day of the release of the report, that there's one aspect that I think Canada should feel very proud of, and that is the Health Canada teams that were put together to accompany the work of the Commission and other aspects of the settlement agreement. And those teams were integrated teams that included, you know, Western-trained medical experts, social workers, psychologists, therapists, and so on, in combination with cultural support experts and traditional spiritual advisors. And people worked together, and those who needed to call on support could choose whichever path or pattern they wanted. And it was an extraordinary and exemplary approach to care that was integrated. And I don't think that we are suggesting it should be all one, it should be all the other, but we need to honor the expertise that's there. And just to back up, that's what happened with the curriculum. In the north where I live, the extraordinary thing that happened is that curriculum was not developed by educational experts, period. It was developed for the first time in combination with residential school former students who had expertise in the subject matter, and their expertise was also brought into the room. So the process of creating it was its own pathway of reconciliation.
Another call to action. You want national standards for Aboriginal child apprehension and custody cases, which would require all child welfare agencies and courts to take the residential school legacy into account in their decision making. How would that make a difference?
Well, I think, to take stock of where we are today, and, we need to recognize that we are now apprehending, and we have in care more Indigenous children today in Canada in 2015, and it is growing, than we had at the peak of the residential school period. So that work, the harms of the residential schools were not all about physical or sexual abuses, which sometimes I think we minimize the whole experience to have been about that. It was also hugely and almost universally for children, the fact of being removed from everything they knew, everything that was familiar, everyone who was supposed to love them, and everyone that they knew, and including languages and cultural things. We are still doing that. And we have to question, why are we doing that? One of the things we talk about in our report is, are we, for example, able to make a distinction between neglect, which is very often the cause of apprehension, and poverty, which is a different issue. Sometimes they're related, but sometimes they are not related. And how is it we can afford financially as a country to invest a tremendous amount of money in paying other people to raise children who are removed from their own homes, but we're not able to find mechanisms for investing that same money, and possibly less for all we know, into the communities, possibly the extended family, if not the immediate family, so that they have the means to raise that child in a way that would not be seen to be neglectful. And we are certainly not suggesting that any child should be left in harm's way. That's not what we are suggesting, and we know there are circumstances where children need to be removed for their own well-being. But they don't have to be removed in a way that actually brings a different kind of harm to them. And that's what we have to arrest.
Are you, in some respects, by laying this all out for the Canadian people, trying to shame and or embarrass the government of Canada to, after 150 years, getting its act together on this?
No, and I've said personally many times over, I don't think there's much to be gained by blame or shame. I don't think it gets us anywhere. I think it tends to send people to their respective corners. I think what we are invited to do, thanks to the courage of the survivors who brought this massive court case that led to the creation of the TRC, it was not political will that created our TRC. It was a court-ordered obligation to create this TRC, and it was the survivors who fought for it. And what it has created is an opportunity for the first time in their history to be heard in depth, in huge numbers. 7,000 people we've recorded. I'm not aware of a wider, in-depth Canadian canvass on any issue about anything. And so to have that degree of expertise offered to us, and then to say, what do we do with that now that we know? Because I, probably like you, probably like most adults in our country, grew up knowing nothing about this, learning nothing about it in our schools, certainly learning nothing about residential schools, and for many of us learning nothing about Indigenous peoples in Canada. We talk as if Canada began when everybody else showed up. We don't talk about it as a complex, rich multiplicity of homelands, home to some of the oldest societies on the planet, and some of the most extraordinary stories of survival and ingenuity. And we've never taken time as a country or as storytellers of our own narrative to celebrate that and to say, isn't this extraordinary? And how can we salvage those things that are not broken to smithereens? How can we support restoration and reclamation in those areas where people are doing incredible work to reclaim language and culture, and where people are taking on children and young people as a way of reinserting that fundamental ingredient of love that children should be able to feel and grow up with, and feel that I too am worthy, I too am good and perfect the way I came into this world, just like everybody else.
So let's leave this, if we can, if it merits it, on a optimistic or positive note. What's the best thing, what's the most positive thing that's happened since the report came out in June in reaction to it?
Well, for me, the measure I have, and I live in a blur on airplanes, but is that I live in a blur on airplanes, because that tells me that people have not stopped talking about it. People still do want to know about it. I've had people from different political backgrounds say, what is it that we need to do with this? I've had many, many, many citizens, and I know my colleague commissioners have as well, say, what do we do with this in the context of the federal election? You all have access to candidates running in your ridings. Ask them all, first of all, have you read the 94 calls to action of the TRC? Secondly, what's your party's position on it? And thirdly, are you going to, I always refer to number 53, it is the call to action that calls for the creation of a National Council for Reconciliation. That would be the body that would keep it alive, that would keep the dialogue alive, that would keep oversight on the other 93 active, and that would serve a kind of the comparison that I would think of as like an Auditor General's role, to be paying attention going forward on closing that gap that I know National Chief Perry Bellegarde has talked about many times as well, and we talk about it in our report. That gap that has the non-Indigenous people of Canada sitting at 6 to 8% in UN indices of well-being, and the Indigenous people sitting at 63rd. That's a big hole. And so we don't have to invent everything, but we do have to have political will from all parties to say this is a priority, this is a foundational piece of our country and who we claim to be, who we tell ourselves we are, and who we tell the world we are. So we're in a wonderful opportunity. People don't have to figure out what to do, they have to read the report and start figuring out a strategic plan for implementing it.
We wish you well with your work.
Great, and I wish you well with yours and all of those people who are part of this. We are all part of this as the people of Canada.
Thank you. Marie Wilson from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Good of you to visit us at TVO tonight.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.